Picture this. A prison cell in Edinburgh, Scotland, 1923. A man sits cross-legged on the stone floor, his wrists raw from the iron cuffs they'd removed just an hour before. He hasn't slept in 3 days. Outside, a crowd of 2,000 people stands in the rain, refusing to leave. They aren't angry. They aren't protesting. They're praying for him, because they've seen what this man can do, what God can do through him, and they are not about to let the authorities have the final word. The guards don't know what to make of it. Neither did anyone who knew where Lachlan Grant had come from. Lachlan James Grant was born on April 3, 1884, in a fishing village on the northern coast of Nova Scotia. A place so small it didn't appear on most maps. The kind of place where the wind came in off the Atlantic hard enough to knock a grown man sideways, where families measured their survival not in dollars, but in how many cod they could pull from the sea before winter sealed the harbor shut. He was the 5th of 7 children. His father, Ewan Grant, was a fisherman who smelled permanently of salt and diesel, a man of few words and fewer emotions. He went to church on Sundays because his own father had, and his father before that. But God, to Ewan, was something like the weather, vast, indifferent, occasionally terrifying, and not especially interested in a Nova Scotian fisherman's opinion. His mother, Agnes, was the opposite. She prayed the way most people breathe, quietly, constantly, without thinking. She would sing hymns while gutting fish, whisper scripture while hanging laundry, press her hands together over the kitchen table after everyone else had gone to bed, and stay there, sometimes for hours. Lachlan watched her do it every night of his childhood. He never once asked her what she was doing. He was 12 years old when his mother got sick. Tuberculosis. In 1896, in a coastal Nova Scotia village with no doctor within 3 hours' travel, that was a sentence, not a diagnosis. A sentence. She died in February. The ice was still thick on the harbor. They buried her in the churchyard on the hill above the village, and the minister said something about God's mysterious will. And Lachlan stood at the graveside thinking one clear, cold thought. If God had a will that included this, he wanted nothing to do with it. He was 17 when he left. He told his father he was going to find work in Halifax. He found work. He also found whiskey and gambling, and the particular company of men who have decided that nobody is watching, and so nothing matters. He wasn't violent. He wasn't cruel. He was something almost sadder than both of those things. He was indifferent. To himself, mostly. He worked enough to eat, drank enough to sleep, and moved through the years the way fog moves through a harbor, present, gray, and going nowhere. By the time he was 23, he had lived in 4 cities, held 11 jobs, and had not set foot inside a church in a decade. The night everything changed, he wasn't looking for God. He was looking for a place to get out of the rain. It was October in Glasgow, Scotland. He'd crossed the Atlantic the previous year, following some vague idea that Europe might feel different, that distance might cure whatever it was that was wrong with him. It didn't. He was standing on Argyle Street, soaked through his coat, when he heard music coming from a building across the road. Not organ music, not the stiff, formal kind he remembered from childhood. This was something else. Voices, dozens of them, singing in a way that made the windows vibrate. He went inside because it was raining. He sat in the back row because he had no intention of being seen. The man at the front was a small Scottish preacher named Reverend Archibald Munn, and he was talking about a woman in the Book of Luke who had lost a coin and turned her whole house upside down to find it. Lachlan had heard that story before. He'd heard it as a child, sitting on a wooden pew beside his mother, half asleep, thinking about the sea. But Reverend Munn said something that night that Lachlan had never heard anyone say before. He said, God is not looking for the impressive. He is looking for the lost. And the difference between those two categories is that one of them knows it needs finding. Lachlan sat very still. He couldn't have explained it afterward. He didn't try. But something in that room, the warmth, the voices, the words, cracked something open inside him that had been sealed shut for 11 years. He didn't cry. He didn't fall to his knees. He sat in the back row of a Glasgow prayer meeting, dripping on the wooden floor, and felt for the first time in a very long time that he was somewhere real. He went back the next night, and the night after that. 3 weeks later, he gave his life to Christ. It wasn't dramatic. There was no bright light, no vision, no voice from heaven, Just a cold Glasgow Tuesday, a man on his knees in a back room of the church, and the quiet, absolute certainty that something had changed. Something in the foundation, something you couldn't see, but could feel the way you feel a shift in the tide before the water actually moves. He wrote a letter to his father in Nova Scotia that night. His father wrote back 6 weeks later. 3 sentences. Glad you're keeping well. Your Uncle Donnie passed in September. The cod have been poor this year. Lachlan folded the letter up and kept it. It was the longest thing his father had ever written to him. What happened next was not what Lachlan planned. He had no plans, actually. That was one of the first things Reverend Munn noticed about him. He had a hunger to serve that wasn't attached to any particular ambition. Most young men who came to faith came with ideas about what they wanted to do with it. Lachlan simply showed up and asked what needed doing. He spent the first year sweeping floors, stacking chairs, making tea, visiting elderly members of the congregation who couldn't leave their homes. He wasn't building toward anything. He was learning how to be present. It was during those home visits that he first saw what prayer could actually do. There was a woman on the edge of the parish, 74 years old, bedridden with a degenerative condition that had left her unable to walk for 2 years. Her name was Mrs. Munro. Every Thursday, Lachlan brought her a meal from the church kitchen, sat with her for an hour, read scripture, and prayed before he left. He didn't pray with any particular expectation. He didn't claim anything or declare anything, he just asked. One Thursday in March 1909, he arrived to find the door open, Mrs. Munro standing in the kitchen. She was holding a pot of tea she'd made herself. She looked at him with an expression that suggested she was as surprised as he was. I woke up this morning, she told him, and my legs worked. The doctor who examined her later that week had no explanation. He wrote in his notes, complete remission of symptoms, no medical cause identified, he told Mrs. Munro she should consider herself fortunate. She told him she already did. Lachlan didn't talk about it much. That was one of the things people noticed about him. He was the least self-promoting man they had ever encountered. Miracles happened around him the way rain happens around a valley, not because the valley is calling for it, but because something about the shape of the place draws it down. Word spread anyway. It always does. By 1911, he was receiving requests from other churches in Glasgow, then from Edinburgh, then from congregations in northern England. He had no training, he had no degree. He had a tattered Bible, a second-hand suit, and an absolute refusal to perform. He would stand in front of a crowd of 500 people and speak the same way he'd spoken in Mrs. Munro's kitchen, directly, quietly, without ornament. And the power that showed up was not his. That was the thing that distinguished him. The people who knew him always said, "You were never watching Lachlan Grant. You were watching something move through Lachlan Grant." The man himself seemed almost beside the point. This is also what made him dangerous to certain people. Have you ever watched someone do something real in a world full of performance? It makes the people invested in performance very uncomfortable. The established church hierarchy in Scotland in the early 20th century was a finely ordered thing. There were channels through which God was expected to operate. There were committees and presbyteries and ecclesiastical courts, and a long tradition of educated men making measured decisions about spiritual matters. Lachlan fit none of this. He hadn't attended seminary. He'd been a fisherman's son and then a drifter, and then an overnight conversion with no pedigree and no institutional backing, and absolutely no interest in acquiring either. 3 different church officials approached him between 1911 and 1914, each with the same offer framed 3 different ways. Come under our authority. Submit your ministry to our oversight. Let us credential you properly. Lachlan listened to each of them with genuine courtesy and declined. Not out of arrogance. He simply believed, and said plainly, that the work he was doing was not his to hand over to a committee. They did not forget this. Meanwhile, the work kept growing. When the First World War broke out, Lachlan went to France as a civilian volunteer, not as a soldier, but as a man who showed up at the edges of field hospitals and sat with the dying. That's all. He sat with them. He prayed with them. He held the hands of young men from Ontario and Quebec and Newfoundland, who were 20 years old and hemorrhaging into the mud of the Somme, and he told them the same thing he told Mrs. Munro in her kitchen. God is not looking for the impressive. He is looking for the lost. He saw things in France that never fully left him. He also saw things that would define the next decade of his ministry. He saw the difference between faith held at a comfortable distance, tidy, institutional, theoretical, and faith that had been pressed up against real suffering and come out the other side still believing. The men who had been in the trenches didn't want sermons about doctrine. They wanted to know whether any of it was real, whether God had actually shown up in human history, whether the resurrection was something that happened in the world or just in Sunday school felt boards, whether there was anything beyond the wire and the mud and the particular sound a human body makes when it encounters artillery. Lachlan told them what he knew. He didn't tell them what he'd been taught. He told them what he had seen. He came back from France in 1919 a thinner man, quieter than before, with a slight tremor in his left hand that never entirely went away. He also came back with a conviction that had hardened from belief into certainty. The church, the real one, the one that actually moved in power, was not a building or a committee. It was wherever broken people gathered and God showed up. He started holding meetings in unconventional spaces, warehouses, community halls, a converted slaughterhouse in Edinburgh's Old Town that smelled faintly of its former purpose, even after 3 rounds of cleaning. He charged no admission, he took no collection. He never asked for money for himself. He lived, for most of his life, on whatever people quietly pressed into his hands because they wanted to, on the meals offered by families he'd prayed for, on a spareness that was not theatrical poverty, but simply the absence of accumulation. The crowds that came were not the respectable sort. This was predictably a problem. Former soldiers with shell shock who hadn't slept without nightmares in 4 years. Women from the Canongate who had never been inside a church because every church they'd approached had made clear, in polite but firm ways, that they were not quite the right kind of people. Men who had been in prison. Men who were about to go to prison. Immigrants. Laborers. People with nowhere else to be on a Tuesday evening and nothing left to lose. The meetings were not orderly. People wept. People fell. People sat for hours afterward, unable to explain what they had experienced, except to say that something in them that had been broken for a very long time felt, at least for a moment, like it might be possible to put back together. Doctors who attended on behalf of the medical establishment, initially sent to discredit, then unable to ignore what they saw. Documented recoveries they could not account for. Blindness. Paralysis. A young man from Leith who had been mute since a shell exploded 3 feet from his head at Vimy Ridge, who stood up in the middle of a meeting and said, in a perfectly clear voice, Newspapers came, the newspapers always come. Some called him a mystic. Some called him a fraud. The Scotsman ran a headline in February 1921, Hysteria or Miracle? The Peculiar Gatherings of Lachlan Grant. The article was meant to be damaging. It sold out by noon and tripled attendance at his next meeting. Through all of it, Lachlan remained almost aggressively unremarkable in his personal life. He woke at 5 in the morning to pray. He prayed in a way that his associates described as less like speaking to a distant God and more like continuing a conversation that had never actually stopped. He walked wherever he could. He ate simply. He laughed easily, especially at himself. He had a particular gift for sitting quietly with people who were suffering without trying to fix them, without filling the silence with religious noise, just being there, present, steady, unalarmed, while they fell apart. He made you feel, one woman told a reporter years later, like the worst thing you'd ever done, or the worst thing that had ever been done to you, was not the final word about you, like there was still a sentence left. It was this quality, this unshakable, undramatic belief that people were not finished, that the establishment found most threatening, not the miracles. Miracles could be debunked or explained or ignored, but a man who could walk into the worst neighborhoods in Edinburgh and make the people there feel seen and valued and called. That was dangerous, that had implications, that asked uncomfortable questions about who, exactly, the church was for. In the summer of 1922, a coalition of church leaders filed a formal complaint with the civil authorities. The charges were vague but serious sounding: disturbing the peace, operating unlicensed public gatherings, practicing medicine without a credential. The last charge was the one they hoped would stick. Lachlan was arrested in January 1923. He did not resist. He walked out of a meeting, shook hands with the officer who came for him, and asked if he could finish the prayer he'd been offering for a woman in the front row who had come in on crutches. The officer said yes. He finished the prayer. He went. He spent 6 days in custody. Outside the prison, those 2,000 people stood in the rain. Inside, by the accounts of the guards who were later willing to speak, something unusual happened. The other prisoners in the facility, men awaiting trial for theft, assault, various offenses of poverty and desperation, began drifting toward Lachlan's cell. Not to intimidate him, to talk to him. Within 3 days, the guards reported. There was a prayer meeting happening spontaneously in the corridor outside his cell, every evening after lights out. 2 men who had not spoken to each other in 3 years of shared incarceration were seen sitting side by side, heads bowed. On the 6th day, the authorities dropped all charges. No explanation was offered. None was needed. The coalition of church leaders who had filed the complaint had, in the intervening week, received more public pressure than they had anticipated. Letters, delegations, former soldiers who had known Lachlan in France, standing outside the church offices in their medals, silent and patient and immovable. Lachlan walked out of the prison on a gray Edinburgh morning and went directly back to work. He did not hold a press conference. He did not publish a statement. He went to the converted warehouse in the old town and swept the floor and set out the chairs for the evening meeting. When people arrived and found him there, they stopped in the doorway and stared at him. He looked up and said, "Sit down. We're starting in 10 minutes. What's the storm in your life right now? What are they saying about you that feels like the end of the story?" Lachlan Grant would have told you that the end of the story is not written by the people who arrest you. The decade that followed 1923 was the fullest of his life. The ministry expanded in ways that had nothing to do with his own efforts. Churches in Nova Scotia wrote to him, asking if he would come home, asking if what was happening in Scotland could happen there too. He went. He came back. He trained others, not in any formal sense, but in the way a man who has learned something true about the world passes it on, by living it in front of people until they start to understand. He never married, not because he had any religious objection to it, but because. And he said this plainly once to a young man who asked. He had given himself so completely to this particular work that there was nothing of him left to offer a partner in the way a partner deserved. It was not a complaint. It was simply an accounting. He said it the same way he said most things, without drama, without self-pity, as though he were reporting the weather. He established a house of prayer in Edinburgh in 1929, a permanent place, open around the clock, where anyone could come and sit and be still. The only rule was that you couldn't tell anyone else to leave. It was funded entirely by voluntary gifts. It operated continuously for 11 years. During the worst of the Depression, it fed 300 families a week from its kitchen. It never announced this publicly. It simply did it. When the Second World War began, Lachlan was 55 years old, too old for the front lines, but he went back to France anyway, in the same role he'd occupied before, a civilian presence at the edges of the worst of it. He was in Normandy in 1944, 3 weeks after D-Day. Men who saw him there described him as a fixture of the landscape, white-haired by then, moving slowly, sitting in the rubble beside men who had nothing left, praying in a voice so low you almost couldn't hear it, which somehow made it carry further. He came back to Edinburgh in 1945. He was 61 years old and looked, people said, like a man who had been somewhere far away and was still in the process of returning. He preached for 9 more years. In his final years, his body began failing. His heart, worn down by the decades, could no longer sustain the pace he demanded of it. He gave fewer meetings. He prayed more. He spent hours each day in the house of prayer he had founded, sitting in the same chair he had sat in since 1929. Doing the same thing he had done every day since that rainy October in Glasgow, simply staying in the presence of God, as though leaving would mean missing something important. The people who came to sit with him in those years described something remarkable, not miracles, although those happened too, quietly, unannounced. What they described was the quality of the silence around him, weighted, full, like the air inside a cathedral after the last note of a hymn has finished echoing. He died on the morning of March 8, 1954. He was 69 years old. He died as he had lived, without fuss, in the same small room he'd slept in for 20 years, having woken at 5 a.m. to pray, and apparently never stopped. They found him kneeling. His memorial service drew people from across Canada and the British Isles, not the powerful, mostly, not the credentialed or the comfortable, but the people he had actually reached. Former prisoners, veterans, a woman from Edinburgh's Canongate, who had walked into one of his meetings 40 years ago with nothing, and walked out with something she'd spent the rest of her life trying to describe. A family from Cape Breton who had written to him during the Depression and received a handwritten letter back from a man they had never met, responding to a letter from strangers. 3 pages long, with nothing in it but what they needed to hear. The letter was framed above their fireplace when the family members came to Edinburgh to pay their respects. They had read it so many times the paper was soft at the folds. Lachlan James Grant left no fortune, no institution bearing his name, no theological system. He left a house of prayer that kept its doors open, and a generation of people who had, through encountering him, encountered something they could not unencounter, and had gone out from that encounter and done the same thing with other broken people in other broken places. He left the question his life had been asking all along, directed now at everyone who heard his story. What would you do if you stopped waiting to be qualified? Comment below with "I am still becoming" if you believe God is not finished with you yet. And if this story moved something in you, subscribe to Light of Witnesses, because the next story we're telling is about a man from the Canadian prairies who lost everything in the Dust Bowl, heard God speak in the silence of an empty field, and went on to reshape the prayer movement across 3 continents. You've never heard his name. You need to.